Well, if you were one of those people who are voting on our website saying that for now you are coping, I'm afraid it might get a lot harder to cope. I'll tell you why. Early forecasts showing that South Africa could be facing another steep fuel price hike in July. These price increases continuing to push the middle class into poverty by worsening indebtedness. How bad is debt? We all know how bad it can be if it's not under control. Let's take a look at the direct and indirect impacts of South African pockets with Debt Rescue SA's Annelien van der Pol. Good to have you back on eNCA, Annelien. Always a pleasure to speak to you. We'll talk in a moment about how many more people are going into debt rescue, debt review, whatever we might want to call it. First of all, help me understand how would debt rescue help someone who is struggling to pay for their fuel prices? What would you recommend?
Well, I think the first and most important thing right now is for consumers to take a very, very hard look at their budgets. It's now more than ever. It's so critically important for us to plan before we do anything. And this includes whether we're going shopping for our groceries or whether we are, putting fuel into our tanks, or even more, getting into our cars, planning that trip before we go. There's a lot of planning that's now being put back onto our shoulders, and it becomes our responsibility to take accountability, and even more so debt. If we incur debt, we need to really understand what this is going to be doing to our budgets every month.
It certainly will, especially, I imagine, a new debt as well. I suppose this is where we have to be careful how we talk about this, because it's one thing for someone to want to go and buy a brand new BMW X5 right now, but maybe they're just not able to pay for the current car and the current fuel costs that they have. Let's imagine someone's not trying to put themselves into more debt. They're just not coping at the moment. What does Debt Rescue do in that case?
Well, as debt counsellors, what we assist with is debt counselling under the National Credit Act. And what we do, we start with that budget for in any case, and we do an assessment to see if they are over indebted. In other words, that after they've paid their necessary living expenses, can they still afford the minimum installments of their debts that they currently have? And if they can't and they're over indebted, we then assist in terms of the National Credit Act through debt counselling, whereby we negotiate with their credit providers to reduce those monthly repayment installments and extend the repayment term, thereby ensuring that those funds that they're short to cover their living expenses is now provisioned by repaying a lower amount monthly towards their debt. Obviously, this also provides legal protection, so no repossession of vehicles or legal action and so forth. So that is the process if you were to apply for debt counselling.
And this is different to being blacklisted. This is the step you should be taking before you get blacklisted. You can get out of debt review, but once you're blacklisted, you're in a real lot of trouble. Help me understand, Annelien, someone watching may, for example, want to go into debt rescue. Right now, living is expensive. Let's say they go through the process, you consider them over-indebted, you are assisting them, but it's still not enough. They feel like they need to get rid of the second car in the family, buy something smaller and cheaper. What's the story there? Because once you're in debt review, you're not able to take on more debt. So how does that work? How can you tell someone that they can't buy a cheaper car for installments and save on fuel because they're now tied into a system? How does that help anyone?
So whilst you're under debt review, yes, that's correct. You cannot incur further debt, because the whole purpose of debt counselling or debt review, it's the same thing, is to assist consumers to repay the debt that they have. And obviously the whole point is to make provision for the installments of what that vehicle costs. So that assessment is done right at the beginning, but also a provision is made for a fuel expense. So that becomes part of your living expenses, making sure that is provisioned. If you're not in debt review, obviously, if you're looking at the cost of maintaining the vehicle that you have, the cost of the actual vehicle, and the cost of transport, etc., start with that immediately. Review that.
Annelien, it looks like I might be losing you for a moment. What does tend to happen is the line does tend to buffer every now and then. Let's give it a couple of seconds. Let's see if I can get Annelien back on. Debt Rescue SA's Annelien van der Pol. We're talking about whether or not you should be going into debt rescue. I was about to ask her what the level of indebtedness is. How much trouble should you be in? But my team telling me now that it looks like it is completely frozen. But if you feel like you aren't making ends meet at all, perhaps debt rescue is the way to go. Annelien, my team telling me you're now back with me. Joys of modern technology and joys of Zoom. Annelien, if you're still with me, you were just finishing your point. We were talking about what you do if you do have a car currently and you're in debt review. You want to get rid of it. It's costing too much money. What can and can't you do?
Apologies for that. We have load shedding here at the moment as well. I think the most important thing here is if you're in debt review, provision should have been made from the start for both the installment of the vehicle as well as your transport expense. So this would be your fuel or diesel or whatever. But if you are not under debt review, immediately start reviewing whether you can downgrade. Can you afford to downgrade? What trade-in would you get for your vehicle and so forth to make those necessary budget adjustments.
So that needs to be done before you go into debt review. Is my understanding correct?
Well, yes. Well, obviously, if you're not under debt review, this could be one of the things to prevent you from having to, look towards debt review as your solution. But once you're in debt review, the whole point of the debt review is to make sure that provision has been made for those installments of the debt, as well as for you to be able to afford the transport costs, because that forms part of your expenses in your budget.
It certainly does. Last question then. Anyone in debt review at the moment? I'm sure there's a lot of people that have signed up with Debt Rescue, especially since COVID. Would the option then be, we're talking about the cost of transport right now, what happens if they were to sell their car? I think you used the term surrendering your vehicle. Does that money come out of what was originally being paid to Debt Rescue each month?
Yeah, it's taken very much on a case-by-case basis to assess the circumstances. The whole point of debt review is that you do not want to have to sell your vehicle or surrender it or whatever the case may be. So I think it needs to be discussed with the debt counsellor to understand what the benefit would be for you to sell the vehicle and for them to help work out the best path forward for you.
It's without a doubt, though, if you find yourself in that situation, debt rescue, debt review just might be the way to go. Do not wait until the bank comes knocking. By the time they're sending letters of demand, it's far too late. There are ways out of it, and one of those is Debt Rescue SA. Annelien van der Pol, always good to have you with us here on eNCA. 26 after 8, speaking of increased fuel prices, let's see what that oil price is looking like this morning.